Hello, welcome to another virtual program from Maine Historical Society. It's September 30th, 2024, and this is our curator talk with John Babin and Avery Yale Kamila on their new exhibit, Maine's Untold Vegetarian History. We're going to get into that exhibit in just a moment. Before we go any further, I just want to take a moment for all of us to pause and remember that Maine Historical Society recognizes that what is currently referred to as Maine is Wabanaki homeland, a place the Wabanaki people have stewarded for over 13,000 years. Wherever we are in Maine, we are on Wabanaki homeland, and we recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we are committed to helping provide education about this history through partnerships with Wabanaki people. Our current exhibit, Music in Maine, is a great example of one of those partnerships. And Wabanaki history also features in the exhibit that we're going to talk about tonight, Maine's Untold Vegetarian History. So let me introduce both of our curators that are speaking this evening. John Babin is the Visitor Services Manager here at Maine Historical Society. He is the author of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in Portland, the Fireside Poet of Maine, published by History Press. And his work as a research assistant has been acknowledged in a number of other published books and articles. And of course, he's one of the co-curators of the exhibit we're looking at tonight. And Avery Yale Kamila is the vegan kitchen columnist for the Portland Press Herald and Maine Sunday Telegram, and founder of the Maine Vegetarian History Project. Her recipe for pumpkin seed croquettes with shiitake mushroom gravy was included in the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, 200 recipes celebrating Maine's culinary past, present, and future, published by Island Port Press. Thank you so much, John and Avery, for being here with us this evening.
Thank you for having us.
It's our pleasure. So we're so excited about this new exhibit, which has generated a lot of interest from MHS's audience. So to start us off, and of course, audience, you are welcome to ask questions too. Just type those into the chat. But I'm going to start us with the first question. So how did this exhibit, how did it come together? What made you decide to mount an exhibit on this topic? Maybe, John, maybe you could start for us.
So Avery has done a number of research projects in our Brown Library right here on the MHS campus. And a lot of times after doing research over at the Brown Library, she would share some information with me. I was fascinated by the information that I didn't know anything about. And that's where Untold History really comes into the title. So I've given Portland talks about Portland history to a number of groups. And there was a lot of stuff that I wish I knew because I would have used it in my talks. I mean, just really great stuff. So the more and more I read her research, I finally asked Avery, I said, will you team up with me? I really think this is something that could really be done. I mean, it's something that has not been done before.
Avery, can you add a little bit to that? Tell us a little bit about that research maybe that John's talking about.
Yeah, the research itself began in 2020 when I uncovered this history. Up until that point, I was completely ignorant that Maine had any kind of vegetarian past. And as a student of Maine history, I am kind of ashamed of myself for not knowing that. But at the same time, it's not included in history books. It's not included in museum exhibitions. It's not included in historical sites. So it's difficult to find this information, but once I realized that it was there, then I started digging and I just found so much. It was like a thread that I just kept pulling. And John is correct. I was in the Brown Library a lot, and I'm so grateful for that resource. My first thread of this history was a piece that took me straight to the Brown Library, where I discovered that the library has a 12-volume diary left by Dr. Horace A. Barrows, who was a 19th century Maine doctor who attended the Medical School of Maine, which was at Bowdoin College, and then practiced in a number of rural Maine towns. And he suffered from some type of chronic illness that he talks about in his diary that led to severe epileptic type fits. It was never diagnosed as to what it was, but he had these severe fits, and he was advised by a really prominent physician who was a teacher at the Medical School of Maine, Dr. Reuben Musey, to try vegetarianism as a way to treat his condition. And he tried it and found that he was successful with it and prescribed it to patients and family members as a treatment for other chronic illnesses. So that was the first piece that I discovered. And yeah, whenever I found something, I just got so excited about it. So I probably would go over to the bookstore and see John and have a lot to say about my discoveries.
That's great. I love it when a project like this happens, so naturally, just out of, the work that someone is doing and sharing that with someone else and seeing the potential to share this with our audience. I think that's wonderful. Now, Avery, you're a vegetarian. You've written about vegetarian living, restaurants, recipes, because you've got a regular column in the Portland Press Herald, and you've been writing about this topic for many years. John, how did you come to be interested in vegetarian history? Of course, you've been talking to Avery, but was there anything else that kind of pulled you into this?
Well, it's kind of a funny story because a couple of weeks ago, Avery and I were actually doing an interview for a podcast, and Avery reminded me of my flexitarian diet that I practice without even thinking about it. And the story is that growing up in an Italian American household, we ate a lot of Italian dishes. My mother was 100% Italian, and a lot of them were vegetarian, and I never thought anything of it. And then when we started working on this project, I was like, wait a minute, I do this a lot, and I don't even realize it. So, but there's some great Italian recipes that are vegetarian.
Excellent. Now, we know that in some parts of the world, vegetarian diets go as far back as thousands of years. How far back does this history go in what is today Maine?
Well, the earliest vegetarian that I've discovered in Maine's history is Father Sebastian Rall, who was a rather controversial Jesuit priest at Abenaki agricultural town by the name of Nanransoak, which today is referred to as Norridgewock. And he was the priest there in that Christian Abenaki town. And he stirred up all sorts of enemies with the British authorities at that time. Britain and France were, competing for who's going to own this land, who's going to be in control of this land. So Rall was on the side of the French because he was a Frenchman, and he was allied with the Abenakis, and he wrote many letters and spoke out in defense of them, the people who lived in Nanransoak. And one of the things that he complained about was the common settler practice of allowing cattle to roam free. And this was done deliberately as a way to gain land in an extrajudicial manner, because cows can mow down a cornfield really quick. And Nanransoak had huge cornfields. And so this was really detrimental to the people and their food security. So Rall was a threat, and the British government was not happy with that. And he was eventually massacred along with many of the townspeople, including leaders of the town and children, in a massacre in 1724. Before that, 2 years before that, he wrote a long letter to a nephew in France, and he talked about what he ate for food in Nanransoak. And he said that his food was cornmeal porridge, which he sometimes added maple sugar to, and otherwise he ate roots and nuts. and that he didn't like the animal-based dishes that his Abenaki neighbors prepared. Now, most historians have interpreted that since as a commentary on the superiority of French cooking versus Abenaki cooking. Now, that's got all sorts of historical prejudice and layers in it, but that's pretty much what's happened. I mean, Father Rall is a prominent person in Maine history. When I read that letter to his nephew, I see somebody talking about a vegan diet in 1722. 1722 also happens to be the year that Benjamin Franklin adopted vegetarianism in Boston. And he found it to be such a frugal way of living that he was able to save a bunch of money and then purchase more books to forward his education. So the education of Benjamin Franklin is thanks to the fact that he was a vegetarian and could afford more books back then in the early 18th century. So Rall is the earliest person that I've discovered. Is he the first person to practice vegetarianism on this land? I don't know. You know, it's hard to know because this is not something that was included in history. So it's just by the fact that Rall was so prominent and his materials have been archived and talked about that we still have that letter and we can, you know, analyze it with a 21st
We know
century.
it goes as far back as at least 1722, but it could go back even further.
Correct. Yeah.
Interesting. So what surprised the two of you in researching and putting this exhibit together? Anything in particular that either of you learned that you didn't expect or just that you found really especially interesting?
Well, in my career here at the Maine Historical Society and working at other museums, I've done some curating on very small levels and I've helped with some exhibits, but I never realized how much it really took the teamwork, the effort that here Avery and I sit here and we take all the credit for this great exhibit that was done by a whole team here at MHS. And I just want to thank MHS, and Avery and I had talked about this. We want to thank MHS for the opportunity to do something like this, something that's never been done before, but also the team here. I mean, especially Tilly, Sophia, and look at the beautiful artwork behind me done by Patty. Just the effort by the team here at Maine Historical Society just amazes me. I'm really impressed with the work. So
Yeah.
thanks.
And for those of you that may not be familiar, so John's referring to Tilly Lasky. She's our curator on staff here. Sophia Yoloris is our images services coordinator and exhibit technician. And Patty Cousins is our designer. So she does a lot of the design work behind like the color palettes and the imagery and the graphics that appear either in MHS exhibits or in our literature and online. And yeah, I think that's very true and very thoughtful of you to say that this, you know, anything like this, it's a real team effort and you guys put together the information. But it takes a lot more people to actually put it into practice and get it into the museum. Avery, what would you like to speak to? Anything that surprised you putting this together?
Well, I think unlike John, I didn't have a basis of what I thought might happen because I had no experience really, you know, with curating a whole show like this. So it was all surprising to me. But I think in the end, it was very similar to writing for newspapers where you might have a big idea, but by the time it's published, it's shrunk down a bit. So there's a lot of editing. So that's familiar. But I think on you know, tagging on to what John said, something that's been really surprising to me, especially knowing the history and how this history has not really been embraced or talked about, is I'm really surprised and impressed by the intellectual openness of Maine's cultural institutions. And I would put Maine Historical Society and the Portland Press Herald / Maine Sunday Telegram right at the top of that list because the museum, the Maine Historical Society, is the one mounting this show, and a lot of my research has been published in the Maine Sunday Telegram. And the Maine Sunday Telegram has employed me to write this plant-based food column for 15 years. And this is unusual So there are very few places in the US that have done anything even close to this in terms of very prominent cultural institutions sharing this kind of information, because this is an underrepresented history. And there's lots of underrepresented histories in our American story and in our Maine story. And I think that, people in general are kind of more open to this
Mhm.
untold history, this unrepresented history of all sorts of different people and movements that has been ignored. Um, but vegetarian history continues to face a lot of prejudice, even, in cultural circles and academic circles. And so I think it's very significant that this exhibit is happening, and it really speaks to an intellectually open approach that Maine Historical Society has, which I think is really refreshing and gives me hope in, a society where there's a lot of disinformation and people are trying to distort messages and put a
Mhm.
spin on things. It's great to see cultural organizations that are willing to do something that's different and first of its kind. That's surprising, and I'm really grateful for it.
It's always exciting to hear when MHS is really on the frontier, and really pioneering something. So that's great. Do either of you have a favorite object or story from the exhibit that you'd like to tell us about?
I think the Sylvester Graham story is the best, and most people are going to remember Sylvester Graham for the graham cracker. Okay,
Ooh.
but it's a great story, and I'm going to hand it off to Avery because she does a great job telling the story.
Well, John's correct that the 1834 Graham riot in Portland is just a fascinating story from all sorts of reasons. Whether you want just, riotous drama, it's got that. It was a sensation when it happened back in June of 1834. It was front page news on newspapers all over the country. And after that, it really disappears from Maine history books. We get a couple mentions late in the 19th century, but beyond that, people don't talk about it. And I find that really curious because it's a significant event for a lot of different reasons. But what happens is Graham comes to Maine in 1834. First, he goes to Brunswick and does a months-long series of lectures, because back in the 1830s, there's nothing to do except for go to events like this and have somebody talk, because you don't have computers and TVs and radios. There's just nothing to do at night. So lectures were huge. So he packed a huge lecture hall in Brunswick night after night for a month in an event chaired by the Maine sitting governor. It was a huge success. Everybody said it was the greatest thing. They were all turning vegetarian up in Brunswick, and the butchers were really afraid that their profession was going to go under. So the next month he comes to Portland, and he sets up and does the same month's worth of lectures. Now, Graham didn't just lecture on vegetarianism. He told people to be a vegetarian, and that was kind of what he was best known for. But he had a whole system of living that he prescribed. And it involved a lot of things that today we just take for granted as health messages, like get enough sleep, take a bath. Nobody took baths back then. That was like radical information. Take a bath, wash your hands, drink water, he said. He was part of the temperance movement. Don't drink alcohol, drink pure water. Wear proper clothing. People wore really constraining, tight, ill-fitting, too hot, too cold clothing back then. So, wearing proper clothing. And that also was a woman's rights sort of concern, because this is the era when bloomers appear. We now call those things pants. And they were a radical invention for women back then. And so he was prescribing a lot of things that were common health messages. And so people gravitated to it. It was really popular in Portland. All of a sudden, we see a new vegetarian health food product being sold in the marketplace, Graham bread. Graham bread meant whole wheat bread. They called it Graham flour because Graham was so famous and such a celebrity in the 1830s and 40s that you didn't have to say anything else. Graham, you say Graham in the 1830s, everybody in the US knows who you're talking about. That's what a big deal he was. And so he's going on for a month, and all of a sudden these bakeries are selling this new product, and the the candy stores are real mad at him because they've lost business. That was another thing he said not to eat, was sugar. He said, stay away from sugar, poison. So he's going along, he's doing a night after night of different lectures. Everything's going really well. The newspaper reports are really encouraging and positive. But then as the month goes on, things start to change and there's a different tone in some of the newspaper reporting. And then we see an ad appear for an anti-Graham lecture that's going to happen at the same time Graham is speaking, just around the corner. And it's likely that the night of that lecture, the people who went to the lecture then marched on the church where Graham was speaking, threw rocks and bricks through the window, broke the windows, caused all the women inside to scream. Graham had to flee out a back door. He was never able to begin his lectures again, or officially close out that lecture series. So what the heck happened? Everybody was in an uproar about this riot that took place in Portland. Everybody's talking about it, but nobody really knew why. Why did it happen? That was the key question. So because of the lack of information, people made assumptions, and they assumed that it was because Graham had the audacity to tell wives and mothers in Portland to cram bran bread down the throats of their husbands. And that's a paraphrase of a newspaper's summation of the situation. So it's because he was forcing vegetarianism on husbands that, people assume that this happened. So that everybody's like, yeah, that checks out. So it must have been that. Well, right. So, and scholars in the 60s looked at Graham and said, wow, another part of his prescription, he was a prude because he was talking about sex. And he was telling people to limit sex, and that if they had too much stimulating food, which could be alcohol, which could be sugar, which could be spices, another thing that you didn't have on the Graham diet, that would, make people have too much sex. So in the 60s, people thought, oh, God, look at this prude. What's wrong with him? But more recent scholars have looked at this and said, well, let's take a step back, because in the 1830s, women had no rights. They had no legal rights. They had no financial rights. They didn't have any rights to their bodies. Their bodies were owned by their husband or their father or a male relative. And sexual harassment was rampant. There was no Me Too movement. There was nobody to complain to. This is just like the reality that women are in. So Graham was telling women in a lecture called the Lecture to Mothers that he only ever delivered 3 times, caused a riot every time. So one of those times was in Portland in June of 1834. The Lecture to Mothers, he was telling women to only have sex at a maximum once a month, and only if you're going to try to have a child. Otherwise, forget it. It's bad for your health. Don't do it. It's for procreation only. He also shared information about female anatomy that was not at all available to people in that day and age. So this was vital health information he was sharing. And this was really threatening to certain men who enjoyed having power over women and did not like him giving them this, information from a respected man. They could go home to their husbands and say, well, this expert said for both of our health, we've got to, lay off things in the bedroom. And so that seems to be what the real cause of the riot was. There were also other layers, because Graham was essentially saying that everybody, man, woman, black or white, we're all the same. We all are the same, and the same kind of health prescriptions are going to be good for everybody. Now that, today we're kind of like, yeah, right. But like back then, that's radical. That's saying that we're all the same in a very hierarchical situation. So that's also, threatening power structures. And the result was the 1834 Graham riot, which I think is just an absolutely fascinating event, and I'm so thrilled that it's included in the show.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and even more fascinating as you kind of pull back all these layers to it. So what's something that you hope people who visit this exhibit, something you hope they'll learn or that they'll take away with them?
I really think that people don't understand like the Graham Riot. When I heard about the Graham Riot for the first time, I'd never heard of this. It's not in the history books. I hope that they realize today vegetarianism and vegan is a lifestyle that's accepted, but it always wasn't. And so I hope people can come to this exhibit and see the past and see where we are today and just how much it took to actually get here. I mean, in Portland public schools, they have hot vegan meals now. I mean, it's a big change, so, but it took a long way to get there.
Absolutely. And folks in the audience, don't be shy. If you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to chime in. So, Avery, you mentioned, this process. It's kind of like writing an article, and that there's a lot of editing. You have a big idea, but sometimes you gotta trim it down. Space is always at a premium, really, for any exhibit, but especially in a place like MHS, where our physical footprint isn't that big. So you got to think about that when you're putting an exhibit together. And I think that, getting everything you want to say in a space that's small is much harder than when you have like a big space to fill with a lot of information. When I was a teacher, I used to tell my students, if I had more time, I'd have written a shorter paper, which is a way of saying it's actually harder to be more concise and to say what you really want to say. So certainly there are some pieces of this history that maybe you didn't have time to touch on here in the exhibit, or there just wasn't the space or the bandwidth to touch on. Where can folks go to learn more about this history? Are there any particular, of course, there's your publication in the Press Herald, but any other particular publications that you recommend, or vegetarian related events that are happening in Maine that folks should know about?
Well, I would say that there are very few places to find out about this information, because it just, nobody's written about it. It really doesn't exist that much. There's bits and pieces of it in various biographies and in various archives, but there's not really a central place. We do have this booklet that the bookstore is selling, which is
so that's available here at MHS. Would you call it like a companion book to the exhibit?
Yeah, it's a companion book, and it's what it is collected columns that have been published in the Maine Sunday Telegram. So for regular readers of that column, this isn't really going to be new information, but for folks who are not readers of that column, this is supplemental information. There's a piece in there about the Graham Riot. There's other pieces where it kind of expands on the information that's in the exhibition, and there's some additional little pieces here and there that are also in the booklet that are not in the show. But it's true. It is you have to edit, but there are a couple events coming up where people might be interested. The first one coming up is October 12th, and it's the 5K run for the animals, a 1K fun walk, and a vegan barbecue. And that's happening up in Freedom, Maine, at the Peace Ridge Sanctuary Northeast Equine Facility. And that's on the 12th. It's a fundraiser for the sanctuary. And then there's a big annual event in Maine, the Maine Veg Fest, and that's coming up on October 26th in Portland. And it'll have food vendors, exhibitors, speakers, and one of the speakers, the keynote speaker this year, will be Seth Tibbett, who is the founder of Tofurkey, which is a really iconic plant-based meat brand sold all around the globe. The product was first debuted in 1995, so it's been around for a while. It was an instant success when it hit, and so he's going to talk about the company. And he is also very well versed in U.S. vegetarian history, and he told me that he's gonna offer some insight into that in his talk as well, and maybe talk about a bit about the history of plant-based meats in the US,
Mhm.
which has a lovely tie to Maine, because we have Ellen G. White grew up in Maine, in Gorham and Portland. And in 1836, she got hit in the head with a rock in Portland when she was walking home from school, just a young girl. They thought she was going to die. She didn't die. She survived and went on to become prophet of a new church called the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And she had just all sorts of visions, thousands of visions throughout her life. One of them in 1863 told her that God's ideal way of eating for humans was to eat plant-based foods. So she didn't really like that prophecy because she liked to eat meat, but she was very committed to serving God and, you know, following what she saw in her prophecies. So she said, okay, now I've got to do this. So she sets out and she's like, well, how the heck are people going to eat vegetarian food? And remember, it's the 19th century. Nothing exists. You've got graham bread and that's your
Mhm.
whole lot. You've got graham bread and water. There's a vegetarian diet. Throw in some vegetables and fruit and that's all you got. So she says she realizes that in order for people to want to eat vegetarian food and eat vegetarian food, it's got to be affordable, accessible, and it has to taste good.
Mhm.
So she sets out on this path and she does something really pivotal. She hires Dr. John Harvey Kellogg to
Mhm.
head the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, which was an all vegetarian, hugely popular water cure in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And she hires him, and he and his brother, W.K. Kellogg, and his wife, they all form together and they invent all these foods that are served at the sanitarium and then are eventually marketed through the mail. And the three pivotal foods that Kellogg you know, invents in terms of like US commercial food production and then popularizes are peanut butter, breakfast cereals, and plant-based meats. Back in the late 19th century is when plant-based meats that we think of now, like the tofurkeys and stuff, really became a commercial food product. And that was at the behest of the US government, who was working in conjunction with Kellogg to develop these alternative plant-based proteins. But those were something that he was selling, and that was all. We can trace it right back to
Oh.
Ellen G. White,
Yeah, I
who
think
grew up.
plant-based meats is a very modern, invention. I had no idea that they went back that far. So we're getting a question from the audience. Is there a place that will hold a working history for folks to add to, especially once we see the show and know of important things that were missed? So and I don't want to answer for John or Avery, but I don't know of any like ongoing kind of like exhibit or repository for this kind of information. But one place that folks can become contributors, like Avery, I know that you're one, is Maine Memory Network, where if you're a collector of history like this, which Avery is, you can become a contributor to our database, Maine Memory Network, where you can upload, you can, scan things from your collection and upload them to Maine Memory Network, so that people from, I mean, not just all over the state, but really all over the world can tap into and can see that history.
And I believe that the online version of this exhibition, which is on Maine Memory
Yep.
Network, I believe people can comment on
Mhm.
that. Maybe if they create a profile. I'm not sure of the details on that, but that would be a place like if somebody wanted to add something specifically to the exhibition, that would be a great place because it would live in a comment on the
Yep.
digital version of the history. And beyond that, like I am always looking for additional pieces of this history. There are a lot of other pieces. I haven't published all the findings that I've had. I've published, some pieces of it, but there is a lot more of it. And I would welcome anyone to reach out to me because I would love to know, if there's another little nugget. And I think that there are lots of nuggets everywhere. Like everything that I found, like it's like, oh, well, and then there's this, and you kind of keep going down this rabbit hole where you can find more. And I think that probably, a lot of the obvious stuff that's in archives, I've found probably a lot of that. I wouldn't say that I've probably found all of it, but there may be more obscure things like,
Sure.
what about diaries? You know, what about
Exactly. Yeah.
there's a
Was your grandmother a vegetarian? Did she keep a diary that might be of interest to somebody that just we don't know exists because it's still in your family's collection? That's a great example.
Right. And I think that a lot of like I've talked to a lot of there are multi-generational vegetarian families in
Hmm.
Maine where like the grandparents and parents and the the children and the grandchildren, everybody's a vegetarian. So there may be some of those kind of documents that are still, sitting in private collections and in attics and stuff that may shed some more light on events. And there may be stuff that's still, out in the public domain somewhere that we'll also, stumble onto and find more information about.
So I've shared the link in the chat, but for folks, anyone else that's listening, if you visit mainhistory.org, you can find the online version of the exhibit. You can find your way to Maine Memory Network. And you can also buy your tickets online to see the exhibit if you want to come see it in person. So it's open now and will be open through May 17th, 2025. So you've still got some time. And our museum is open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 5, if you want to come see us in person. Be advised that we usually close for a bit in the winter, like in January and into early February, to do some work on our exhibits and shuffle things around. But you can learn all about the exhibit, how you can see it online, and how you can see it in person if you go to mainhistory.org. So thank you so much again, John, Avery, for being with us tonight and for talking about the exhibit and sharing what you've learned and your experience putting it together. Any other thoughts that you'd like to leave us with before we close out our discussion?
I'd just like to say thank you again for the opportunity to get this information out there.
Yeah, I'll echo what John says. I mean, I think it's a real asset that Maine Historical Society is exploring this history and making it available to people to learn about. And I would also just say that one of the things about this history that is interesting to me is that it comes and it goes. So vegetarian history goes like this throughout time. And it doesn't mean that vegetarians disappear when we go down. It's just that mainstream attention on vegetarianism waxes and wanes. So we've
Mhm.
been in a period for roughly the last 50 years where there's been a lot of mainstream attention on vegetarianism. So we're riding one of these waves on the upswing. But we may head down again. That's
Sure.
the typical trajectory. When 1722, when Benjamin Franklin and Father Rawle were adopting vegetarianism, I think that was one of these times when there was a upswing. There's not a lot of documentation of that time period in general, and certainly not of, vegetarianism and vegetarian ideas in the US, because we were such a very young project at that point. But just keep that in mind that this attention on this history does wax and wane. So I'm
Mhm.
always get my eye out for what may be coming down the pipe.
Sure. Well, thank you again. This was really interesting stuff. It's a great exhibit, and I hope that everybody that's listening will find time to come and visit and see it in person soon. So thank you again, and have a good evening, everybody.